They say wisdom comes with age, but I've learned that clarity true. Crystalline clarity comes only when you're forced to see the people you love for who they really are. The moment arrives without warning, like a cold blade sliding between your ribs, precise and devastating in its simplicity. My name is Edward Miller, and at 80 years old, I thought I had seen everything this world could offer. Built an empire from nothing but stubborn determination and calculated risks. Buried the love of my life after 43 years of marriage that felt simultaneously like a lifetime and a single perfect day. Raised 2 children who I believe carried pieces of my heart, fragments of my soul, reflections of the man I'd tried so desperately to become. I was catastrophically wrong about that last part. The realization came wrapped in the innocent words of a 7-year-old, delivered during what was supposed to be the celebration of my 8th decade on this earth. But let me start at the beginning, because every good story, especially one about betrayal that cuts to the bone, deserves its proper foundation, its careful architecture of pain. If you feel like this story might reach you somehow, follow the channel. That way, you help me bring more stories like this, and we grow with every life we learn from. You see, I've always believed that the most profound truths are revealed not in grand gestures or dramatic moments, but in the quiet spaces between words, in the fleeting expressions that cross a face when someone thinks no one is watching. Tonight, I learned that sometimes those truths can destroy everything you thought you knew about the people who share your blood. Chapter 2. The golden cage we call home. The mansion in Coral Gables had been Margaret's dream, conceived during our 3rd year of marriage when we were still young enough to believe that happiness could be purchased with the right combination of limestone and Spanish tile. 37 rooms of meticulous Spanish colonial revival, perched on 3 acres, overlooking Biscayne Bay like a monument to ambition realized. The gardens alone had taken her 15 years to perfect. Each rosebush positioned with the precision of a master painter. Each pathway curved to catch the morning light in exactly the way she'd envisioned. I kept every rosebush exactly as she left them after arthritis claimed her some fingers and cancer claimed her life. Even hired the same gardener she'd trained for 15 years. A weathered Cuban man named Carlos, who spoke to the flowers in Spanish and wept the day Margaret died. Some might call it sentiment. I call it keeping promises to the dead, honoring the dreams of the woman who taught me that wealth without beauty is just elaborate emptiness. Tonight, the house pulsed with laughter and conversation, the kind of carefully orchestrated celebration that money can buy, but happiness cannot guarantee. Crystal glasses caught the light from the Venetian chandeliers Margaret had insisted upon. Edward, darling, we're not building a hotel. We're creating a legacy. While 200 guests mingled on terraces that cost more than most people's homes. They were celebrating a milestone I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to reach. 80 years of living. 8 decades of building and fighting and winning and losing and somehow surviving it all. The guest list read like a who's who of Miami society, peppered with business associates who'd made fortunes alongside mine, politicians whose campaigns I'd funded, socialites whose charity galas had benefited from my checkbook. They moved through my home with the practiced grace of people accustomed to wealth. Their conversations a symphony of carefully modulated voices discussing stock portfolios and vacation homes and the latest acquisitions that would cement their status in whatever invisible hierarchy governed their lives. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my entire adult life accumulating wealth I'd never fully enjoyed, creating a legacy for children who saw me as nothing more than an obstacle to their inheritance. A stubborn old man whose continued existence stood between them and the life they felt entitled to live. But I'm getting ahead of myself, letting bitterness color what should be a methodical recounting of events. Let me tell you about the moment everything changed. The instant when the carefully constructed illusion of family love crumbled like ancient parchment exposed to flame. Chapter 3. Out of the mouths of babes, I was standing near the infinity pool, a modern addition that Margaret had initially resisted, but eventually embraced for the way it seemed to merge with the bay beyond. The water reflected the Miami skyline, those towers of glass and steel twinkling like scattered diamonds against the velvet night sky. The air carried the mingled scents of jasmine from the garden and expensive perfume from the guests, creating an atmosphere that should have felt like triumph, but instead felt strangely hollow. That's when small fingers tugged at my sleeve with the determined persistence that only children possess. Emily, my youngest granddaughter, looked up at me with those enormous green eyes that reminded me so much of Margaret, it sometimes stole my breath. At 7, she still possessed that quality of startling honesty that adults spend their entire lives trying to reclaim or forget. "Grandpa," she whispered, glancing around with the conspiratorial air of someone about to share state secrets. "Can I tell you a secret?" I knelt down slowly, feeling every one of my 80 years in the protest of my knees, bringing myself to her level. The black tie crowd continued their revelry behind us, unaware that the most important conversation of the evening was about to unfold between an old man and a child who still believed in the magic of whispered confessions. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, placing my weathered hand gently on her shoulder. "What's on your mind?" Her next words hit me like a physical blow, delivered with the casual honesty that only children possess. The kind of truth that adults learn to bury beneath layers of social nicety and calculated silence. "Mommy and Daddy were talking in their room last night. They didn't know I was listening, but I was getting my bunny from under their bed. They said they're going to get all your money after the party. Daddy said it's about time because you're getting really old and they've waited long enough." The world didn't stop. The music didn't pause. The laughter from the terrace continued unabated, as if the universe hadn't just shifted on its axis. But something inside me, something I'd thought was unbreakable after burying my wife and weathering every storm that 8 decades can throw at a man, cracked clean through with an almost audible snap. I maintained my smile through sheer force of will, the same expression I'd worn through hostile takeovers and corporate battles and the endless, grinding negotiations that had built my fortune. I patted Emily's cheek with a gentleness that belied the storm raging inside my chest, and told her she must have misunderstood, that grown-ups sometimes say things that sound different than they mean. But we both knew she hadn't misunderstood. Children hear everything with the clarity of fresh snow, and they repeat it with devastating accuracy, because they haven't yet learned that some truths are too sharp to speak aloud. "Run along now, little one," I said, my voice steady despite the earthquake in my chest. "Find your cousin Michael. I think he's by the chocolate fountain, probably trying to figure out how to smuggle some strawberries to his room." As Emily skipped away, her white party dress floating around her like something from a fairy tale, I remained crouched by the pool, staring at my reflection in the chlorinated water. The face looking back at me was lined and weathered, a roadmap of 8 decades of decisions both wise and foolish. But the eyes held a sharpness that hadn't dimmed with age, a calculating intelligence that had built empires and destroyed enemies and survived every betrayal the business world could devise. If Robert and Linda thought their old man was ready for the grave, ready to shuffle quietly into whatever sunset awaited wealthy patriarchs who'd outlived their usefulness, they were about to learn just how catastrophically wrong they could be. Chapter 4. The performance begins. I straightened slowly, feeling every vertebra protest the movement, and returned to the party with the measured steps of a man who just discovered that his entire world was built on quicksand. But now I was no longer the guest of honor, the beloved patriarch celebrating another year of life surrounded by family and friends. I was an observer, a predator studying his prey with the patient intensity of someone who'd learned to read human nature like a financial statement. Every conversation took on new meaning, every glance carried weight, every laugh felt calculated and false. The party continued around me, elaborate masquerade where everyone wore their wealth like costume jewelry and their affection like stage makeup. Robert stood near the mahogany bar, his 6-foot frame draped in an Armani suit that probably cost more than most people earned in a month. The expensive tailoring couldn't disguise the softness that comes from never having worked for anything in your life, never having felt the particular terror of risking everything on a single decision. At 45, my eldest son had the bearing of someone perpetually waiting for his real life to begin. as if the years of plenty I'd provided were merely a prologue to the main event of his inheritance. He was deep in conversation with his wife Linda, their heads bent together in the conspiratorial posture of people planning something they shouldn't be planning. Even from across the room, I could see the tension in their body language. The way her manicured fingers drummed against her champagne flute. The way his eyes kept darting toward me, and then away like a guilty child caught with his hand in the cookie jar. Linda, beautiful, ambitious Linda, had married my son for his last name and the fortune it represented. I'd known this from the moment she'd walked into our lives 15 years ago, her designer smile never quite reaching her calculating eyes. Her conversation peppered with just the right number of references to charity work and cultural interests to pass the social acceptability test. She'd produced Emily and had been the perfect daughter-in-law ever since, playing her role with the dedication of a seasoned actress who knew that her performance would determine the size of her eventual payday. I watched them now, seeing them truly for the first time. The way you might suddenly notice that a painting you'd admired for years was actually a clever forgery. The way Linda's smile faltered for just a microsecond when she thought no one was looking. The way Robert's hand tightened around his crystal tumbler of 30-year-old Scotch, my Scotch, from my collection in my home, while he planned my demise. The way they both straightened and switched on their charm like actors, hearing their cue when other guests approached their little tableau. "Dad," Robert called out when he spotted me approaching, his voice carrying that particular note of false joviality that I'd somehow managed to miss for years. "There you are. We were just telling the Hendersons about that time you bought the entire block in South Beach for practically nothing. What was it? 67? 68? 1969, I corrected, accepting the kiss on both cheeks that Linda offered with European affectation. Different times, when a man's word meant something and family meant everything. The Hendersons laughed appreciatively, the way people do when they're in the presence of money and power. Everyone loved stories about my legendary business deals, especially the ones that made them feel like they were part of some exclusive club, witnesses to the mythology of American success. I'd been telling these stories for years, watching people's eyes light up with the reflected glow of my achievements, never realizing that my own son saw them as nothing more than inventory in a warehouse he was waiting to inherit. "Those were the days," Robert agreed, raising his glass in a mock toast, "when you could buy half of Miami Beach for the price of a decent condo today." "That was different times," I repeated, my voice carrying an undertone that Robert, in his excitement, completely missed. When a man's word meant something, and family meant everything. Linda's smile flickered for just a moment, like a candle flame touched by an unexpected breeze. Robert's hand tightened imperceptibly around his scotch, but they recovered quickly, as they always did, their masks sliding back into place with practiced ease. "Family does mean everything," Linda agreed, her voice honey-sweet, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. "We're so blessed to have you, Edward. You're such an inspiration, and Emily especially adores her grandfather. She talks about you constantly." The mention of Emily sent a cold wave through my chest, a reminder of innocence caught in the crossfire of adult greed. My granddaughter, honest, trusting Emily, was trapped in the middle of their machinations, a pawn in a game she couldn't possibly understand. That was when I made my decision, not for revenge exactly, but for justice, for truth, for the lesson they so desperately needed to learn. If Robert and Linda wanted to play games with my legacy, they were about to discover that their opponent had been practicing for 80 years. Chapter 5. The daughter returns. The evening took an unexpected turn when Sophia arrived, making her entrance with the kind of understated drama that only she could manage. I hadn't seen my daughter in 3 years, not since the bitter argument that had driven her to Seattle and the life she'd built in defiance of everything I'd offered her. She stood in the doorway like a beautiful storm, her silver hair catching the light from the chandeliers, wearing a simple black dress that probably cost more than most people's cars, but somehow managed to look effortless. At 52, Sophia had inherited her mother's elegant bone structure and my stubborn streak, a combination that had made our relationship complicated from the day she was born. When she'd emerged into the world with clenched fists and an expression that suggested she was already planning her escape. The room fell silent as heads turned, conversations trailing off mid-sentence. Sophia had always had that effect on people, a presence that demanded attention without asking, a gravity that pulled focus like a black hole pulls light. She built her own fortune in tech, starting with nothing but intelligence and determination, refusing every penny I'd offered over the years with the kind of principled stubbornness that I secretly admired, even as it frustrated me beyond measure. Robert and Linda's faces went through a series of interesting expressions: surprise, calculation, and unmistakable fear. Sophia's presence changed the mathematics of their inheritance, introduced a variable they hadn't accounted for in their careful planning. I could practically see the gears turning in their heads as they recalculated percentages and reconsidered strategies. "Hello, Father," Sophia said, crossing the room with measured steps that somehow managed to part the crowd like Moses parting the Red Sea. Her embrace was brief but genuine, carrying the weight of our shared history and the possibility of reconciliation. I thought it was time we talked. The crowd gradually resumed their conversations, but I could feel the undercurrent of speculation rippling through the room like electricity through water. The prodigal daughter returns. What did it mean for the family fortune? What secrets would emerge from this reunion? What drama would unfold now that both Miller children were under the same roof for the first time in years? I found myself genuinely glad to see her, despite everything that had passed between us, all the arguments and disappointed expectations and stubborn silences. Sophia had never asked me for money, never expected anything beyond what she'd earned herself through late nights and brilliant ideas, and the kind of relentless work ethic that I recognized because I built my own empire the same way. In that moment, standing in the midst of a party celebrating my mortality while my son plotted my demise, she represented something I'd almost forgotten existed: integrity. "We have a lot to discuss," I said quietly, my voice carrying underneath the party noise to reach her ears alone. Her gray eyes so much like Margaret's, so sharp and intelligent and uncompromising, studied my face with the intensity of someone who'd learned to read people for a living, who'd negotiated deals with men twice her age and come out ahead every time. "Yes," she said, understanding passing between us like a shared secret. "I think we do." Chapter 6. Conversations in the Dark. After the last guest had departed, and the catering staff had cleared away the remnants of celebration, the lipstick stained glasses and crumb-scattered plates and wilted flowers that always made parties feel like crime scenes, the house settled into the kind of uncomfortable quiet that follows false revelry. Robert and Linda had lingered, ostensibly to help clean up, but I knew they were waiting for something. Perhaps they expected some grand announcement, some indication of their imminent windfall, some sign that their patient performance was finally going to pay off. I disappointed them by simply saying goodnight and retreating to my study, leaving them to exchange meaningful glances and whispered conversations that I was no longer supposed to hear. The study had been my sanctuary for decades, a room lined with first edition books and photographs spanning a lifetime of memories, both triumphant and tragic. Margaret smiled at me from a dozen silver frames, frozen in moments of happiness that felt simultaneously distant and immediate. Our wedding day, the births of our children, vacations in places whose names had since changed, business triumphs that had seemed so important at the time, but now felt like footnotes in a larger story about love and loss and the terrible weight of time. I poured myself a Scotch Macallan 25, the same bottle I'd been saving for special occasions that never seemed special enough, and settled into the leather chair where I'd made my most important decisions, where I'd planned hostile takeovers and orchestrated mergers and calculated the exact price of other men's dreams. The amber liquid burned pleasantly as it slid down my throat, carrying with it the smoky taste of Scotland and the bitter sweetness of understanding. Tonight felt like the end of something, though I wasn't yet sure what would begin in its place. Sophia found me there an hour later, carrying her own glass of wine and wearing the expression of someone who'd been thinking carefully about what she was going to say. "Mind if I join you?" she asked, settling into the chair across from my desk without waiting for an answer. Some things never changed. Sophia had always been someone who took what she needed rather than waiting for permission. "I was wondering when you'd come," I said, not entirely surprised by her appearance. "Conversations like ours can't be conducted in front of an audience." "Robert called me last week," she began, swirling the wine in her glass and watching the liquid catch the light from the desk lamp. "Very concerned about your health, your state of mind. He thought I should know you've been acting differently lately." I laughed, a sound with no humor in it, the kind of bitter amusement that comes from recognizing the punchline of a joke you've been telling yourself for years. Differently how? More secretive, spending time with lawyers, talking about legacy and unfinished business, making cryptic comments about the future. Sophia sipped her wine, stunning me over the rim with the same intensity she'd inherited from her mother. "He's worried you might be planning something dramatic." "Smart boy," I said, unable to keep the sarcasm from my voice, though not as smart as he thinks he is. "Edward." Her voice carried the weight of our shared history, all the arguments and reconciliations, all the pride and disappointment and stubborn love that had defined our relationship. "What's going on? And don't tell me nothing." I didn't fly across the country to make small talk about the weather. So I told her about Emily's whispered confession, about the realization that had crystallized during my own birthday party like ice forming on a warm window, about the way her brother's eyes had changed when he looked at me, the subtle shift from love to calculation, from son to heir apparent, counting the days until his inheritance arrived, about Linda's performance, so carefully crafted and so completely false that I wondered how I'd ever believed it was genuine. Sophia listened without interruption, her expression growing darker with each detail, her hands tightening around her wine glass until I worried it might shatter. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, processing the information with the analytical mind that had made her fortune in Silicon Valley. Finally, she spoke, her words carefully chosen and devastating in their simplicity. "I can't say I'm surprised," she said. "Robert's been living beyond his means for years, borrowing against expectations of an inheritance that he's never bothered to earn. And Linda, well, Linda married into the family business, not the family. And you?" I asked, the question I'd been afraid to voice hanging in the air between us like smoke. "Are you here for your share of the inheritance?" Sophia's laugh was sharp, cutting through the shadows of the study like a blade. "Father, I haven't needed your money since I was 30. I'm here because Margaret asked me to watch over you." The words hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs and leaving me gasping in the sudden vacuum of understanding. What? Before she died. In those last weeks, when the pain medication made her lucid in ways that were almost frightening, Sophia leaned forward, her eyes intense in the lamplight. "She made me promise that if you ever needed me, really needed me, I would come, no matter what had passed between us. She said you were too proud to ask for help, but too smart not to see trouble coming." The scotch turned to ash in my mouth as the implications of her words sank in. She knew? She knew, Edward, about Robert and Linda, about what they really wanted, what they were waiting for. She saw through Linda's performance from the very beginning, but she hoped, we all hoped, that love might be stronger than greed, that family bonds might prove more durable than financial calculations. I set down my glass with hands that had begun to tremble, not from age but from the terrible weight of understanding. Margaret had always been the wise one, the one who saw people's hearts with painful clarity. She'd known what our son had become, what his wife represented, and she'd still hoped for something better. Even dying, even in those final moments when every breath was a struggle, she'd been thinking about protecting me from truths I wasn't ready to face. "So, what's the plan?" Sophia asked, her voice carrying the steel that had made her successful in a world dominated by men who underestimated women with gray eyes and quiet voices. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and saw not the rebellious child who'd rejected everything I'd tried to give her, but the woman who'd built her own empire and come home when her family needed her. Saw the daughter who'd inherited the best parts of both her parents and forged them into something uniquely her own. "The plan," I said slowly, feeling the pieces fall into place with the satisfying click of a well-made lock. is to give everyone exactly what they deserve. Chapter 7. The Architect of Consequence. Over the next 3 weeks, I became a man with a mission, though I was careful to hide my newfound purpose behind the familiar facade of elderly routine. My daily schedule remained unchanged: morning coffee on the terrace, where Margaret and I had shared 43 years of sunrise conversations. Lunch at the Coral Reef Club, where I'd conducted business deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Evening walks through Margaret's garden, where I could almost hear her voice in the whisper of wind through the roses. But beneath the surface of normalcy, I was orchestrating something far more complex than any real estate deal I'd ever negotiated, more intricate than the most hostile takeover I'd ever attempted. This was personal, and personal battles required a different kind of strategy, a more delicate touch. My first stop was Parker, Davidson & Associates, the white shoe law firm that had handled my affairs for 20 years. The offices occupied 3 floors of a glass tower in Brickell, with windows that offered panoramic views of Biscayne Bay, and the kind of understated luxury that screamed old money to anyone who understood the language of power. James Parker was a man who understood discretion, the way a surgeon understands anatomy, completely and without question. His office overlooked the bay, the windows offering a view that had inspired more than one hostile takeover and dissolution of partnership. He was the kind of lawyer who charged $1,000 an hour and was worth every penny, because he understood that the law, properly applied, was less about justice than about leverage. "Edward," James said, rising from behind his mahogany desk with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent 40 years perfecting the art of making wealthy clients feel like old friends. "This is unexpected, though given recent events, perhaps not entirely surprising." I settled into one of the leather chairs that probably cost more than most people's cars, feeling the familiar comfort of being in a place where money talked and everything else whispered. "Recent events?" Robert has been making inquiries. Through other firms, naturally, he wouldn't want to create any awkwardness with our existing relationship. James's diplomatic language couldn't quite mask his distaste for clients who went shopping for more favorable legal opinions. "Questions about the structure of your estate, the possibilities for expediting certain processes." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity, like a jigsaw puzzle revealing a picture you'd hoped you'd never have to see. Robert wasn't just planning to inherit. He was exploring ways to accelerate the timeline, investigating the legal mechanisms that might speed my departure from this world. The implications sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the office's aggressive air conditioning. "What kind of inquiries?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the answer. Competency hearings? Questions about undue influence? Explorations of what constitutes adequate medical care for elderly clients? James's voice remained professionally neutral, but I could see the distaste in his eyes. "Nothing actionable, you understand, but concerning." The betrayal went deeper than I'd imagined. It wasn't enough for Robert to wait for nature to take its course. He was actively considering ways to remove me from the equation, to declare me unfit and assume control of my assets while I was still breathing. "I need to make some changes," I said simply, the words carrying more weight than their simple construction suggested. What followed was 3 hours of meticulous planning, the kind of legal choreography that James Parker specialized in and that had made his firm legendary among Miami's elite. We restructured the trust, created new entities, established safeguards that would have impressed the most paranoid billionaire. But the masterstroke was the mechanism I designed for the final revelation. A series of conditions and triggers that would expose everyone's true motivations before a single dollar changed hands. "Are you sure about this, Edward?" James asked as we reviewed the final documents, each page heavy with the weight of consequence. "Once this is set in motion, there's no going back. No changing your mind if sentiment overcomes strategy." I thought of Emily's innocent face, of Margaret's warning delivered through Sophia, of Robert's calculating eyes as he planned my demise. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. "And the timeline?" "Soon," I said, feeling the satisfaction of pieces falling into place. "Very soon." Chapter 8. The test began. The beauty of my plan lay in its subtlety, its complete absence of dramatic gesture or obvious confrontation. I didn't change my behavior dramatically. That would have raised suspicions among people who'd spent years studying my patterns, waiting for signs of weakness or opportunity. Instead, I began dropping carefully crafted hints, planting seeds that would bloom into exactly the kind of thinking I wanted to observe. At Sunday dinner, a family tradition I'd maintained even after Margaret's death, partly from habit and partly from the perverse pleasure of watching my heirs perform their weekly charade of familial devotion. I mentioned feeling tired lately, not sick, exactly, but aware of my mortality in ways I hadn't been before. The reaction was immediate and telling. Linda's fork paused halfway to her mouth, suspended in the air like a conductor's baton frozen mid-symphony. Robert's eyes sharpened with interest, the way a shark's do when they detect blood in the water. Only Emily continued eating her pasta with the focused determination of a 7-year-old, who understood that dinner was fuel for more important activities like dessert and bedtime stories. Sophia, who had begun joining these dinners with increasing frequency since her return, simply continued eating her salad, though I caught her watching Robert and Linda's reactions with the analytical gaze of someone who'd learned to read people's motivations like stock reports. "Maybe you should see Dr. Morrison," Robert suggested, his voice carrying just the right note of concerned son, carefully calibrated to sound loving rather than calculating. "Just for a checkup. Peace of mind, you know?" "Perhaps," I agreed, cutting my steak with deliberate precision. Though at my age, peace of mind is a luxury. There's so much still undone, so many decisions that can't be postponed indefinitely. "Undone?" Linda's voice carried just the right note of concern, though I noticed her hand tightening around her wine glass. "What do you mean, Edward?" "Legal matters. The foundation I've been considering for Margaret's memory. Decisions about the future of the company, the disposition of assets." I sipped my wine, watching their faces over the rim of the crystal glass Margaret had chosen for our 20th anniversary. "I suppose I should make some final arrangements. Well, I still can." The effect was immediate and exactly what I'd expected. Over the following days, both Robert and Linda found reasons to visit more frequently, their concern for my well-being suddenly blossoming into daily phone calls and surprise appearances at the house. They asked pointed questions about my health, my plans, my relationship with various family members. They were gathering intelligence, positioning themselves for maximum advantage when the moment came. Linda began bringing little gifts, my favorite cookies from a bakery in Coconut Grove, books about travel destinations I'd mentioned wanting to visit, flowers from her garden that happened to match the ones Margaret had loved. Each gesture was perfectly calculated to demonstrate her thoughtfulness, her position as the caring daughter-in-law who deserved recognition for her years of service. Robert started having lunch with me more often, sharing stories about his work with the kind of enthusiasm he'd never shown before. He asked my advice about business decisions, sought my opinion on investments, created the illusion of a son finally ready to learn from his father's wisdom. The performance was so convincing that for moments I almost forgot it was exactly that, a performance. Emily, bless her heart, remained my constant companion during these visits, oblivious to the adult drama swirling around her like a dangerous tide. She would sit on my lap while I read her stories from the same books I'd read to her father and aunt decades earlier, or walk with me through the garden, chattering about school and friends and the elaborate dollhouse I'd commissioned for her upcoming birthday. Her presence was both my greatest joy and my strongest motivation. I would not let her grow up in a family that valued money more than love, calculation more than character. Chapter 9. The revelation 3 months after my birthday party. After weeks of careful observation and meticulous planning, I invited the family to our house in Key Biscayne for what I called an important discussion about the future. The beach house had always been Margaret's favorite retreat, a place where the sound of waves had soothed her through chemotherapy and the final months of her illness. It seemed fitting that it should host the conclusion of this particular story. The house sat on a stretch of private beach that Margaret had loved for its isolation, its sense of being removed from the world of business and obligation that had defined so much of our life together. We bought it in 1985, back when Key Biscayne was still more fishing village than resort destination, and Margaret had spent decades turning it into something between a sanctuary and a work of art. Robert and Linda arrived first, their tension palpable despite their carefully maintained smiles. They dressed for the occasion, Robert in his most expensive suit, a charcoal brioni that had probably cost $5,000. Linda in pearls that had belonged to Margaret, and a black dress that managed to look simultaneously respectful and expectant. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. They were dressed for a funeral that hadn't happened yet. Sophia came next, bringing Emily with her. My daughter had been spending more time with her niece lately, a development that had clearly worried Robert and Linda, but which they couldn't object to without revealing their true concerns. Emily ran immediately to the beach, her white dress bright against the sand, her laughter carrying on the ocean breeze like a reminder of what innocence sounded like. James Parker arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, carrying the leather portfolio that contained the new will and all its carefully constructed surprises. He moved with the deliberate precision of someone who understood that the next hour would either validate months of planning or destroy a family entirely. We gathered in the living room, with its floor-to-ceiling windows facing the Atlantic Ocean. The afternoon light filtered through the palm trees outside, casting shifting patterns on the white furniture Margaret had chosen for its simplicity. Everything was exactly as she'd left it, down to the shell collection displayed on the mantel, each piece carefully selected during our walks along the beach in those final years when walking had become difficult but necessary. "Thank you all for coming," I began, remaining standing while the others took their seats. The power dynamic was important. I wanted to be the one looking down, the patriarch delivering judgment rather than an old man pleading for understanding. I know this seems formal, but at my age, formality becomes important. There are things that need to be said, documents that need to be signed, truths that need to be acknowledged. Robert's hands were clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles had gone white, the skin stretched thin over bone like parchment over a frame. Linda sat beside him, the picture of attentive concern, though I noticed her eyes kept darting to the portfolio in James's hands like a gambler watching the dealer's cards. "James will be reading from my revised will," I continued, letting the words sink in like stones dropped into still water. "But before we begin, I want each of you to know how much you mean to me. Family is everything. It's what we build for, what we sacrifice for, what we hope will outlast our mortal bodies." I paused, looking out at the ocean where Emily was building sandcastles with the single-minded focus that only children possess. Her innocence in that moment was both heartbreaking and inspiring, a reminder of what we should be protecting instead of what we too often destroy. "However," I said, and the single word hung in the air like a sword about to fall. Like the moment before thunder when the world holds its breath, before we discuss inheritance, I think it's important that we discuss something else first, something that happened 3 months ago on the night of my birthday party. Chapter 10. The truth unveiled. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of waves against the shore and Emily's laughter drifting through the windows. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause, as if the house itself was holding its breath. "Emily," I said gently, my voice carrying the weight of authority and love in equal measure, "do you remember the secret you told me that night? About what you heard your parents discussing?" Linda went pale, the color draining from her face like water from a broken vessel. Robert's face cycled through confusion, realization, and panic in the space of a heartbeat, each emotion clear as words on a page. Emily began, looking uncertainly between her parents and me, sensing the shift in atmosphere with the intuitive awareness that children possess. She'd come in from the beach when she heard voices, sand still clinging to her dress, her hair tousled by the ocean breeze. "It's okay, sweetheart," I assured her, kneeling down to her level and taking her small hands in my weathered ones. "You did nothing wrong. You simply told your grandfather the truth. That's what we do in this family. We tell each other the truth, even when it's difficult, even when it hurts." Robert found his voice first, though it came out strangled, desperate. "Dad, I think there's been a misunderstanding. If Emily heard something, she must have taken it out of context. You know how children are. They hear fragments of adult conversations and create their own stories. We would never what? I asked, rising slowly to my full height, feeling every one of my 80 years, but refusing to show weakness in this moment that would define everything that came after. Never discuss my death as if it were an overdue business transaction. Never calculate the exact moment when your patience would finally pay off. Never investigate legal ways to expedite my departure from this world. Children, I continued, my voice carrying the weight of 80 years and 3 months of careful observation, are remarkably accurate when it comes to reproducing conversations they've overheard, especially conversations about money and death, and how long they'll have to wait for both. Linda's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the desperate calculation underneath. Edward, I think you're making too much of this. Robert and I would never ... We love you. We've been nothing but loving and supportive all these years. Loving? I laughed, a sound with edges sharp enough to cut glass, bitter enough to turn wine to vinegar. You've been loving my bank account. You've been supportive of my continued existence, only as long as it didn't interfere with your timeline for inheritance. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you believe that age had made me blind as well as vulnerable? The accusations hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, acrid and inescapable. Robert's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, a fish gasping for water that would never come. Linda's hands trembled as she reached for her purse, as if she could somehow escape this moment by simply leaving, as if the truth could be outrun. James, I said, not taking my eyes off my son and daughter-in-law, savoring this moment of revelation like wine aged to perfection, please read the relevant portions of my will. James opened the portfolio with the reverent care of a man handling explosives, each movement deliberate and precise. His voice, when he began to read, carried the authority of law and the finality of judgment. To my son Robert Miller and his wife Linda Miller, for their years of patient waiting and careful planning, for their diligent research into my mortality, and their creative approaches to inheritance law, I leave the following: $1 each, and my sincere hope that they will find a way to earn their own fortune through honest work and genuine effort. The words echoed in the sudden silence like gunshots, each syllable a bullet aimed at the heart of their expectations. Robert's face went through several shades of red before settling on an alarming purple, his carefully constructed composure crumbling like a house built on sand. "You can't do this," he said, his voice barely controlled, cracking like thin ice under pressure. "I'm your son. I'm your blood. You can't just—" "I can do exactly this," I replied with the calm certainty of someone who'd spent months planning this moment, savoring it like revenge served at the perfect temperature. "I have. But we're not finished yet, Robert. There's more." Chapter 11. The Complete Judgment. James continued reading, his voice growing stronger with each word, each revelation another nail in the coffin of Robert and Linda's expectations. To my daughter Sophia Miller Chun, who has built her own life and asked for nothing beyond what she earned, who came home when her family needed her despite years of estrangement, I leave the house in Key Biscayne and sufficient funds to maintain. It is a family retreat for future generations who understand the difference between inheritance and entitlement. Sophia's eyes widened, but she said nothing. She'd learned long ago that my gestures came with purpose, that every decision was calculated for maximum impact. This wasn't charity. It was recognition of character, reward for integrity in a family that had apparently forgotten what the word meant. To my granddaughter Emily Miller, the only member of my immediate family who values truth over treasure, innocence over calculation, I leave a trust fund that will provide for her education, her dreams, and her future, with one condition. She must use it to build something meaningful, something that makes the world better rather than simply making her richer. Emily looked around the room in confusion, understanding that something important was happening, but not yet grasping its full significance. At 7, she couldn't comprehend the magnitude of what had just been placed in her future, couldn't understand that she'd inherited not just money, but responsibility. And finally, James read, his voice carrying the weight of finality, the remainder of my estate, including all business holdings, investments, liquid assets, and real estate not otherwise designated will be transferred to the Margaret Miller Foundation for Children's Education, ensuring that my wealth will benefit those who need it most rather than those who want it most. Chapter 12. The reckoning. The explosion, when it came, was everything I'd expected and more a symphony of rage and disbelief. That would have been entertaining if it weren't so pathetic. Robert surged to his feet, his carefully controlled facade shattering like crystal against stone. "This is insane. You're an old man who's lost his mind. We'll contest this. We'll fight it in court until there's nothing left, until every liar in Miami knows your name. You're welcome to try," I said, with the mild tone of someone discussing the weather, though inside I felt the savage satisfaction of a predator who'd successfully stalked his prey. Though I should mention that every conversation you've had with other law firms about expediting my death has been documented. Every inquiry about my assets, every calculation about your inheritance, every scheme you've hatched while believing I was too old and trusting to notice. The color drained from Robert's face as the implications sank in. You had us followed? I had you investigated? Yes, thoroughly. The private detective I hired has quite a comprehensive file on your activities over the past 6 months. Your consultations with the state attorneys, your discussions about competency hearings, your research into what constitutes adequate medical care for elderly parents. I smiled, feeling the weight of months of preparation behind the expression. Did you really think I built a fortune worth hundreds of millions of dollars by being careless about security? Linda was crying now, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of frustrated greed, the anguish of someone watching their carefully laid plans crumble into dust. "How could you do this to us?" she demanded, her voice breaking with the strain of maintaining her performance even now. "We're family. We've been nothing but loving and supportive. We've sacrificed years of our lives taking care of you. Loving?" I laughed again, the sound echoing off the windows that faced the ocean where Margaret and I had spent our happiest moments. "You've been loving my bank account. You've been supportive of my continued existence, only as long as it didn't interfere with your timeline for inheritance. You sacrificed nothing. You invested time and effort in what you saw as a guaranteed return. Did you think I wouldn't notice the way you looked at me after Margaret died? Like I was a problem to be solved, an obstacle to be removed? Did you believe that age had made me blind as well as vulnerable?" Sophia had remained silent throughout the outburst, but now she spoke quietly, her words cutting through the chaos like a knife through silk. "Robert, you should leave. Now, before you say something you'll regret even more than what you've already said. Don't you dare lecture me." Robert turned on his sister with venom, his carefully constructed mask finally falling away completely to reveal the entitled, grasping creature underneath. "You disappeared for 3 years, and then waltzed back in just in time to steal what should have been mine. You planned this whole thing, didn't you? Convinced him to cut me out so you could take everything." "I didn't steal anything," Sophia replied with the calm certainty of someone who'd never needed anyone else's money to define her worth. "I never asked for anything. Unlike you, I never spent my adult life waiting for our father to die so I could cash in on his success." The truth of her words hit Robert like a physical blow. He stood there for a moment, swaying slightly, his world tilting on its axis as everything he'd counted on disappeared like smoke in the wind. Finally, he turned to me with eyes full of something that might have been hatred, might have been desperation, might have been the final recognition that he'd gambled everything and lost. "This isn't over?" he said, his voice hollow, defeated. "Yes," I replied, meeting his gaze steadily, refusing to give him even the comfort of looking away. "It is. It's been over since the moment you chose greed over love, money over family, calculation over compassion. The only question now is whether you learn from this experience or let it destroy what little character you have left." Robert grabbed Linda's hand, pulling her toward the door with the desperate urgency of someone fleeing a crime scene. "Come on, we're leaving." As they reached the threshold, I called out one final time, "Robert." He turned, perhaps hoping for some last-minute reprieve, some indication that this was all an elaborate test with forgiveness waiting at the end. Instead, I said, "Your mother knew. She knew what you become. what Linda represented. And she hoped, we both hoped, that you might find your way back to the man we raised you to be. This is your opportunity to do that. Don't waste it." He left without another word, Linda trailing behind him like debris in his wake. The sound of their car starting, then driving away, felt like the final punctuation mark on a chapter I'd hoped never to write. Chapter 13. After the storm and the silence that followed their departure, the house seemed to exhale, releasing tension it had been holding for months. The ocean continued its eternal rhythm, indifferent to human drama, while the afternoon light shifted across the floor in patterns that Margaret had loved to watch. Emily looked up from her tablet when she retrieved it. Children had an amazing ability to find normalcy in chaos with the matter-of-fact curiosity of someone too young to understand the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Grandpa, why were Mommy and Daddy so upset?" I knelt down beside her chair, taking her small hands in my weathered ones, feeling the weight of 8 decades and the responsibility of shaping the next generation. "Sometimes, sweetheart, people forget what's really important. They think money is more valuable than love, and when they realize they're wrong, it makes them very sad." Are they going to be okay? It was a question that cut straight to the heart of everything: forgiveness, redemption, the possibility that even the most lost souls might find their way back to grace. Would Robert and Linda be okay? Would they learn from this devastating lesson? Or would they spend the rest of their lives bitter and resentful, blaming everyone but themselves for their circumstances? "I hope so," I said honestly, because children deserve honest answers, even when the truth is complicated. People can change, Emily. Sometimes losing everything is the only way they learn what they should have been holding on to all along. Sophia moved to sit beside us, her hand gentle on Emily's shoulder. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," I said, looking out at the ocean where Margaret and I had watched countless sunsets, where we planned our future and mourned our losses and found peace in the simple act of being together. We remember what family really means. We take care of each other. We build something beautiful from what remains. James gathered his papers, preparing to leave us with the wreckage and the possibility of renewal. Edward," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 40 years in the law. "I've been practicing for 3 decades, and I've never seen anything quite like this. Are you sure you're at peace with your decision?" I thought about the question as I watched Emily return to her tablet, already accepting this new reality with the resilience that children possess in abundance. I thought about Margaret, who had seen this day coming long before I'd been willing to acknowledge it. I thought about the foundation that would bear her name, the children who would benefit from educational opportunities my wealth could provide, the legacy that would outlast any family drama. "James," I said finally, feeling the satisfaction of a plan executed flawlessly, "I've never been more at peace with anything in my life." Chapter 14. The unexpected return 6 months later. On a Tuesday morning that began like any other, I received an unexpected visitor. I was in Margaret's garden, deadheading roses with the methodical precision she taught me, when Carlos appeared at my elbow with the expression of someone bearing news he wasn't sure how to deliver. "Senator Miller," he said in his careful English, "there is someone at the front door. Says he needs to speak with you." Robert stood on my doorstep, and the transformation was startling. He was thinner than before, his expensive clothes hanging loose on a frame that had lost the soft padding of privilege. The entitled arrogance had been stripped away like paint from old wood, leaving behind something that might, with time and effort, develop into genuine humility. "Dad," he said simply, the word carrying more weight than any of the elaborate speeches he'd delivered in the past. "Can we talk?" I invited him in, offering coffee that he accepted with hands that shook slightly withdrawal from a lifestyle he could no longer afford, or simply the tremor of a man who'd learned that the ground beneath his feet was less solid than he'd believed. We sat in the living room where this story had begun, with Margaret's photographs watching over us like benevolent spirits. "I've been thinking," Robert said after a long silence, his voice carrying a quality I'd never heard before: uncertainty, vulnerability, the sound of someone who'd learned that the rules he'd lived by were written in disappearing ink. "About what you said, about Mom knowing, about choices and character and what really matters." I waited, understanding that some conversations couldn't be rushed, that redemption was a delicate plant that required patience to grow. Linda left me, he continued, the words coming slowly, as if each one cost him something. Took what little we had left and filed for divorce. Said she married into money, not poverty, and she wasn't interested in being married to a failure. His laugh was bitter, but perhaps tinged with something that might become wisdom. Funny thing is, I'm not even angry. I think I finally understand what you were trying to teach me. And what's that? That inheritance isn't something you wait for. It's something you earn. Every day, through how you treat people, how you live your life, how you love your family. He looked up at me with eyes that reminded me, suddenly and painfully, of the little boy he'd once been. The child who'd climbed into my lap for bedtime stories and believed his father could fix anything. I want to earn it, Dad. I want to earn the right to be your son again. I studied his face, looking for traces of manipulation or calculation, the old patterns that had defined our relationship for too many years. But I found only exhaustion and perhaps the beginning of genuine remorse. The kind of bone-deep understanding that comes only from losing everything you thought mattered. It won't be easy, I said, testing the weight of forgiveness in my voice. Trust, once broken, is a fragile thing to rebuild. I know, but I want to try. I want Emily to know her father as someone worthy of respect, not just someone who disappointed everyone who ever loved him. He paused, gathering courage for what came next. I've been looking for work. Real work, not the consulting jobs you arranged for me. I want to build something of my own, even if it's small, even if it takes years. We talked until the sun set over Biscayne Bay, casting the same golden light that had blessed Margaret's final evening. When Robert left, I couldn't say for certain whether he would follow through on his promises of change. People are complex creatures, and transformation is never guaranteed, especially when it comes late in life and costs so much. But for the first time in months, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. Hope. Epilogue. The lesson learned: a year has passed since that afternoon in Key Biscayne, when I gave my family the greatest gift I could offer, the truth about themselves, and the opportunity to choose what kind of people they wanted to become. Emily still visits every weekend, still tells me her secrets, still believes in the fundamental goodness of people, despite having witnessed one of the most painful betrayals a family can endure. She asks about her parents sometimes, and I tell her what I believe to be true, that people can change, that love is stronger than greed, and that the most valuable inheritance anyone can receive is the knowledge of right and wrong. The Margaret Miller Foundation has funded 3 new schools and provided scholarships to over 200 children. Every monthly report feels like a letter from my departed wife, telling me that our wealth is finally serving its proper purpose. The foundation's offices are filled with photographs of graduates, young faces bright with possibility, dreams funded by money that might otherwise have been wasted on luxury cars and expensive vacations. Sophia has become my unexpected ally, moving back to Miami to help oversee both the foundation and the family healing that might eventually become possible. She brings Emily to visit regularly, and sometimes we sit in Margaret's garden, 3 generations learning from each other in the way families should. She's also reconnected with Robert, offering the kind of sibling support that money can't buy and success can't replace. Robert has followed through on his promises more consistently than I dared hope. He found work with a small real estate firm starting at the bottom, learning the business the way I'd learned it 60 years ago, through sweat and determination rather than inherited connections. He rented a modest apartment, traded his luxury car for something practical, began the slow process of rebuilding his relationship with Emily on a foundation of honesty rather than entitlement. I've watched him struggle, watched him make mistakes, watched him slowly begin to understand what it means to earn something rather than simply expecting it. There have been setbacks, moments when the old patterns reasserted themselves, when the temptation to take shortcuts proved too strong. But each time, he's pulled himself back, remembered the lesson that cost him everything to learn. Linda, I'm told, has moved to New York, where she's searching for her next wealthy husband with the persistence of someone who learned nothing from her experience with my family. Some people are capable of change. Others are simply capable of finding new victims. I wish her no ill, but I'm grateful she's someone else's problem now. As for me, I wake each morning with the satisfaction of having lived long enough to see justice done, not through revenge, but through consequence. I gave my family the greatest gift I could offer, the truth about themselves, and the opportunity to choose what kind of people they wanted to become. Some gifts are painful to receive, but the most valuable lessons usually are. In the end, I suppose I did what every parent hopes to do. I taught my children something important about life. Whether they choose to learn from that teaching, whether they use it to become better people than they were, well, that's up to them. After all, inheritance isn't just about money. It's about character. And character, unlike wealth, can only be earned through the choices we make when we think nobody is watching. I was watching. I am always watching. And now, finally, I can rest easy knowing that my real legacy, the one that matters, the one that will outlive every dollar I ever earned, lives on in a granddaughter who values truth over treasure, a daughter who chose integrity over inheritance, and maybe, just maybe, in a son who learned that the only wealth worth having is the kind you earn through becoming worthy of it. The roses in Margaret's garden are blooming again, tended by hands that remember her lessons about patience and care. The foundation bears her name and continues her work of nurturing young minds. And somewhere in a modest apartment across town, my son is learning what it means to be a man rather than just an heir. That, I think, is the kind of inheritance that truly matters. The kind that enriches souls rather than bank accounts. The kind that builds character instead of just portfolio value. The kind that would have made Margaret proud. Thank you for staying with me and listening this far. Your attention is a gift. Did these minutes mean something to you? Then please, follow the channel. Every click from you is a push that helps me keep bringing stories that truly stay with us.